Hello, YouTubers. This is the final part of my watershed assessment. Today I'll cover some characteristics of a reach within the East Fork portion of the Little Miami watershed, which to a larger degree represents the river and the tributaries throughout. This isn't an absolute assessment. At some of the measurements, they were estimated, and I used photography such as satellite imaging to do that. First, I will cover what I have gone over so far. In summary, the monitoring and analysis done in the watershed over the past decade or so has revealed phosphorus to be a limiting but increasing factor due mainly to high concentration of agriculture within the basin. Though there are instances of contaminants found in the watershed, such as pesticides and oxygen demanding substances, the wastewater treatment plants are currently doing a good job of efficiently treating incoming sources for the most part. So Lake Harsha continues to be a concern with regards to harmful algal blooms, which the US EPA and Ohio EPA have been monitoring very closely for the past 5 to 10 years every spring and summer. And of course, downstream of this lake is the Little Miami main stem, which is considered a national scenic river. So the following four slides are based on a method established by Rosgen, however you say it, and his concept of stream classification types. Measurements are based on past data from studies, again, or general estimations that I did using photo references and a bit of GIS. As you can see, the width to depth ratio is pretty high here, and this is a big piece of the assessment or the classification method. There isn't much slope or elevation in the watershed, as it's entirely within a region of typically rolling hills that are common in southeastern Ohio. Stream length is also based on East Fork reaching down to the Little Miami main stem, but it's representative of many streams also in the watershed. The entrenchment ratio is given based on bankful and flood-prone widths, which came out to be the highest classification of entrenchment. As you can see by this picture here, it gives you a good idea. The classification is represented closely, by box A there. And the banks were not completely vertical at the stream reach I used, but it's a good example. The channel itself consisted of mainly medium-sized cobble, about a size between baseballs and basketballs. A good way to look at it. Banks were primarily clay sediment with some finer silt-like areas. They had somewhat compacted soils where vegetation was present, especially small tree roots. So, following the method, I got a classification of an F-type for Little Miami East Fork with slope and channel materials that also defines it further as a 3B, so an F3B, which I have pointed out here. The F-type is often considered, by definition, very meandering in size systems, which is mostly true for this watershed. They are also geared toward developing a functional floodplain back inside the channel. So, though in parts of this is true, you'll see a variety of areas within the East Fork that already have a floodplain established. Another highly relevant aspect between F-type and the watershed is the incidence of highly erosive patterns that cut away bank walls. Up in the in the headwaters, you can probably see more G-type streams, but they only flow seasonally, and usually they're characterized by a decent amount of incline and deeper channels relative to bankful height. Still, this is nothing compared to classic G-type systems that function more like in canyon system watersheds. And here's some examples of F3B, which don't look anything like mine, but if you take away the larger valleys, um, it would be very similar. Probably less large boulders too. So in addition to the Rosgen classification, I've also included the BEHI, or Bank Erosion Hazard Index, for my watershed. This field assessment it characterizes the conditions of erosion in my specific study reach, but also a mix of estimates made in the watershed at large. Bank heights were generally low, as you can see, but as in the F-type, some incised banks were present, which are harder to see because they're kind of occluded by vegetation. Root depth was moderate to high, as there was typically at least sparse grass lining the banks when larger trees weren't present. And root density was low to moderate, with the soils meeting and mixing with various sizes of cobble. Surface protection. Well, since a majority of the reach was protected by vegetation, I also took into account that there are many stretches that have development adjacent to the stream, so this was moderate. And finally, bank angle was low to moderate. The reach itself was pretty uniform here, but other stretches become much more steep with the occurrence of incision and erosive conditions. Overall, it's considered a very low grade, but I imagine measuring more reaches in concentrated urban areas would probably yield a raise to moderate levels. So, things to consider in the future. Daunting problems are becoming the norm, basically because of urbanization and continued agriculture. It is a concentrated urbanized area relative to the city of Cincinnati, so there is a lot of sprawl happening. So none of these assessments that I showed are very static by any means. As mentioned before, those urban areas definitely cause more sediment entrainment and thus bank erosion. So things overall are trending toward worse conditions in that regard. The biggest emphasis on my watershed, which I covered in the past presentations, is the continued degradation of beneficial uses that are impacted by extreme nutrient enrichment from these agricultural areas surrounding the watershed and within. This leads to those harmful algal blooms, which restrict fishing and, at some points, recreational activities in the lake, the dominant lake in that watershed, which they use to gather drinking water and so forth. So there's a concern that with all the HABs happening in this lake, they're going to push downstream and end up in the main stem as well, and then you have a real problem. But the good news is many local partnerships have been made to reduce and preserve the phosphorus and other nuisances entering the watershed. So this is a good step forward to addressing HABs, or harmful algal blooms, and prevent the problem from spreading. With how vast the watershed is, I hope these presentations have been at least informative. The smaller process is taking place here. It can be overwhelming from a restoration perspective, but I find the East Fork, Little Miami, to be a good glimpse of both how urbanization and agriculture can quickly degrade streams if not accounted for. Yeah, and please let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.